Hello, everybody. This video is not going to be the usual format. Okay, this video is more like a presentation, and I'm making this video in response to a lot of criticism I received about my video about Stephen Krashen and his input hypothesis. So I'm making this video to answer that criticism specifically. Um, because I think it's really important. It's a really important subject to further the discussion about how to learn a language, right? Which is really, it's a discussion I'm interested in as a language teacher. So I'm gonna just start with a very quick kind of important point. Okay, so my video was about the input hypothesis. Okay, Stephen Krashen's input hypothesis, which I said was bullshit. And at no point did I say that systems that focus on input, like mass input approaches or immersion approaches, whatever you want to call them, I didn't talk about those. Okay, so if you felt attacked or offended, then you were barking up the wrong tree, okay? Because I was talking about an academic theory. But I've come to realize that there's probably nobody or very few people who actually would follow this pure or the strong version of Krashen's hypothesis. So in this video, I am going to talk about mass input approaches and if they really are the best way to learn a language. Okay. And one more thing that I need to clear up, okay, which is that input is really important. I didn't say that, I didn't explicitly say that in my original video. I thought it was obvious, just from maybe from the previous content that I've made, or just from logic. I thought it would be obvious that input is really important, but it wasn't. So let's all agree that input is really important, okay? There's an important distinction here. One is input is really important. Another one is input is the only thing you need. They are two very, very different things, okay? I never said that input isn't important. I said that input is not the only thing you need. And that's why the input hypothesis is bullshit, right? So that's important. And in in this video, I'm going to stick to the facts, or I'm going to present evidence. I'm not going to be giving my personal opinions, or I'm not going to be trying to make any brain surgery comparisons. Okay, so don't worry about that. So let's get straight into the criticism. Okay, so one really common criticism was that I was worried about losing students or money. That was my motivation for making the video. Another motivation was that I just wanted the controversy. Um, yeah. If you look at the content that I make, it's very abstract. It's of interest to a very small amount of people. Um, I don't make content for views. I never have. Um, so, and about losing students or losing money, I don't sell anything on the internet. So, the idea that I'm worried about my position as a language teacher, I'm worried about losing students. I don't have anything to lose. Um, so what was my motivation for making the video? There's a couple of things. So, um, I want to give you some historical context. Okay, so in spite of being severely criticized by researchers, Krashen's model had a major influence on language teaching in the USA in the 1980s and 90s, including avoidance of the explicit teaching of grammar in many hundreds of classrooms. The pendulum has since begun to swing back in the opposite direction, with formal grammar teaching increasingly being introduced, especially with adults, who are able to benefit from and may even need an explicit explanation of grammatical structure. So the historical context is that Krashen was really influential, especially in the United States, Californian bilingual program about pushing this no grammar idea. And then we swung back the other way to kind of grammar heavy, studying approach. But now I see that it's coming the other way. Every day I'm seeing more and more programs that are a kind of no study, a no study thing, which a no study sales technique, right? Like learn a language without studying. This I see this happening, so that's why I thought it was a good moment to talk about this. Also because recently the Stephen Krashen and Noam Chomsky published a video together where again Stephen Krashen repeated his motto, right? His famous little anthem that we acquire languages in only one way, when we understand them. And it upsets me to think that, well, some of those videos have millions, hundreds of thousands of views, and so I'm responding to that, to this very confident assertion of his that this is truth, right? This is truth. Okay, so next criticism, very common. You don't know anything about language learning. I don't know anything about language learning. So it's very difficult to say how much you know about something, right? And in fact, I think a good representation of this is Dunning-Kruger, where your confidence, okay, so how much you feel you know about something, is represented this way, right? And then your competence, like how much you actually know, is represented this way. And this is actually, I think, a really great representation of learning. Okay. So at the beginning, when actually you don't know very much about a subject, you do feel like you know a lot, right? You have super high confidence. But then as you learn more and more and more, you realize how little you know, right? And then slowly, as you increase your knowledge, you come back out of that valley of despair. And so I suppose the question is, where am I on this chart? I've definitely been here on the peak of Mount Stupid. I think a lot of people in the YouTube comments section think that I'm still here. Fine. I feel like I've been in the valley of despair, and I think I'm probably here somewhere. I know that I don't really know enough, and I know there's a lot more to learn, and my confidence is, but you don't know what you don't know, right? So it's very difficult for me to say how much I know. I don't know how anyone could say that. Okay, another criticism, another really common one. I bet you've never learnt a language ever, so therefore we shouldn't listen to you, or you're talking shit because you've never learnt another language. Or if people do know that I speak Spanish, they're like, your Spanish is really bad, horrible accent, he speaks like a baby, right? If you believe this, then you believe that your language ability in a second language corresponds to your teaching ability. Or similarly, that your language ability in a second language corresponds to your knowledge of language learning. Now, if this was true, then unfortunately you would not be able to believe or follow a majority of language acquisition research, because of the language acquisition researchers that I know of, that I've spoken to, a lot of them are very interested in language, really interested in it, and but they dabble in it, they play in it, but I don't really know any that would claim to have a high competency in a language they've learnt as an adult. There are certainly bilingual language acquisition researchers, but who have acquired it as an adult. Um, not many, which is true for the general population, right? And in fact, this would include Stephen Krashen himself, who has studied multiple languages, but as he says himself, he is not fluent, or he is not doesn't have a high level in any of them. So if you believe this to be true, then you also must not believe the input hypothesis, because it's created by a man whose language ability is intermediate, right? Um, and if you believe that language ability and knowledge, or that teaching ability, are related, then that would mean that polyglots are the best language teachers in the world. And if you believe that to be true, and if you believe that any monolingual teacher, if you believe that any monolingual teacher is a bad teacher or shouldn't be teaching, then I can't help you to overcome that ignorance. Um, okay, so let's look at another piece of criticism. So I learned languages using only input, so that proves that it works. Really, oh man, a lot of people said this. And so I think the idea is that because I did it, that proves that it's true. Um, uh, but what I want to do is I want to have a look at whether or not this holds up to scrutiny. Okay, so let's look at some other very well-known polyglots. This is Richard Simcott. And the way that he likes to learn languages is he likes to go in the classroom with a teacher and study. And he likes to have a lot of human interaction. He's a social animal, that's how he describes himself. Luca Lampariello has developed his own system, which he calls bidirectional translation, which involves him translating in and out of different languages. Alexander Arguelles, another very famous polyglot, and this is from an interview of his, he says that I like reading, studying, and practicing grammar, as well as my own technique called shadowing, which involves walking briskly outdoors while listening to a recorded language and repeating it out loud. Another famous polyglot, Kato Lom, she was Hungarian. She wrote this book, Polyglot: How I Learn Languages. And she describes her language learning method. She starts with a dictionary. She likes to just look at words and get a feeling for the language. And then when she's done that, she likes to use exercise books and do all the grammar activities. And then finally, we have Benny Lewis, whose motto is, of course, speak from day one. Everyone knows about Benny. And I hope that this proves something which, again, everybody really knows, is that there is more than one way to learn a language. Okay? And there's a difference between saying, I learned language with input, so therefore it works. That's fine. I mean, no one is arguing that input, getting a lot of input, as I said, is really important. But there's a difference between that and what Stephen Krashen says, which is that you only acquire language in one way, when you comprehend it. And all of these other polyglots are living evidence that that is not true, because they all study in different ways. Okay, so if it was true that you only acquire language through input, then these people would not exist, right? I'm sure that some of you watching this video are like, well, they get input because it's a feedback. I don't know. Whatever. I can't argue with that. If you believe all of these are just weird types of input, fine. Fine. Okay, another one, a really big one, which is that I did not understand the difference between acquisition and learning. You know, in my video, I was talking about acquisition and learning. And in fact, in my video, I said, would you believe in a teacher that said that I will teach you to acquire a language, but not to speak it? And people said, Christian doesn't even understand this very fundamental concept about the difference between acquisition and learning. So let's talk about that for a minute, okay? So this is the acquisition learning hypothesis, okay? And again, and this is important, this distinction is not accepted by everybody. This is a distinction that was created by Krashen himself, okay? It's not as if the field of language acquisition agrees with this, or this is not, let's say, this is not accepted fact, okay? This is another part of his hypothesis. It says that acquisition learning states that adults have two distinct, independent ways of developing competence, okay? Which is, so acquisition is subconscious and learning, which is conscious, okay? Evidently, acquisition is to be identified with Chomsky's language acquisition device. Although Krashen is not very clear on this, acquisition is a process similar, if not identical, to the way children develop ability in their first language. Learning, on the other hand, refers to conscious knowledge of second language, knowing the rules, being aware of them, being able to talk about them. The distinction between conscious and unconscious knowledge, or between conscious and unconscious mental processes, is uncontroversial. We can all agree that some things we learn without studying them. We can all agree on that. And Krashen recognizes this, but his hypothesis goes further. Specifically, he says that adults can access the same natural language acquisition device that children use, and two, that learning does not turn into acquisition. So that's why I said this, okay? Because if you do believe in Krashen's input hypothesis, then as a teacher, I would not be able to teach you to speak a language. I would not be able to teach you grammar. I would not be able to teach you, pronunciation. The only thing that I could do would be to provide you with comprehensible input, right? And so your acquisition, well, if you do speak or write, that will only be a result of input, okay? It won't be as a result of my teaching. So if I was to follow his hypothesis, then when I enter the classroom, I'd say, listen, I can teach you to acquire a language, but I can't actually teach you anything else because because all of the other things are a result. They're a result of acquisition, which would mean that there would be no point having a teacher, which is what a lot of people in the comments have said. You don't need teachers. The teaching industry is terrified of Krashen because it's the end of teaching as we know it. Okay, if you believe that, that's fine. But what's the evidence for this, right? Because let's be clear. Learning does not turn into acquisition. This is a fundamental part of his theory. So let's take a look at a group of people where we can apply this idea. Okay, so I've chosen a study which is about children who have developmental language disorders. Okay, so these children already have problems with language. They're finding it difficult to learn to acquire language. So the question is, can we teach it to them? Can learning become acquisition? And this is the study. Okay, it was published in the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing Research in 2018, and this was their conclusion. Okay, study findings indicate that compared to implicit instruction, children are more likely to acquire maintain, and generalize novel grammatical forms when taught with explicit instruction. Further research is needed to evaluate the use of explicit instruction when teaching true grammatical forms to children with language impairment. This is just one example of many. Okay, if you spend a little bit of time Googling, you can find hundreds of examples where children, adults have been taught explicitly grammatical forms. Like, this is how you make the past simple. This is how you make the gerund. This is the word for this. They've been taught it explicitly. And this research shows that they're more likely to learn it in that way. Okay, so Krashen's differentiation, okay, his idea that learning and acquisition are different, and that if you learn something, it cannot become acquisition, is disproven by research. Okay, so that's why I said in my video that exact thing. Okay, right, next one. The input hypothesis doesn't say that you can't speak. I know that it doesn't. I never said that it did. The input hypothesis is a scientific hypothesis. It doesn't tell you what you should or shouldn't do in the classroom. The scientific hypothesis makes a prediction, and the prediction is that you will only acquire language through comprehensible input. Okay, this is part of this is the theory here, the 5 parts: acquisition, learning, monitor, natural order, input, and effective filter. Okay, so if you're telling me the input hypothesis doesn't say you can't speak, I know that. I'm not talking about that. I didn't say that in the video. Okay, we're talking about whether it's true or not that you can only acquire language through input. Okay, next criticisms. And again, this was quite common. Every child learns a language through only input, and we are born to acquire language. Let's see if that's true. Okay, so this is the 2nd edition of Introducing Second Language Acquisition by Muriel Saville-Troicki. And this is what it says in the beginning. It says, along with input, social interaction is also essential for L1 acquisition. No children can learn their initial language by merely listening to tape recordings, radio broadcasts, or television programs. That is quite an important point, right? Language is a social tool. And if you want to suggest that children are born to learn language and that they only learn that language through input, well, there's evidence that it's not true. More evidence. Okay, this is from the Encyclopedia of Infant and Early Childhood Development, 2nd edition. Language is not a unitary phenomenon. Let's see what it says here. So, I'm sorry if this text is very small. Children who are not exposed to a conventional language model create communication systems that contain some, but not all, of the properties found in human languages. Thus, the absence of a conventional language model appears to affect some properties of language more than others. Even when linguistic input is present, it is more likely to affect the rate of acquisition for certain properties of language than others. Further, when language is acquired, off-time, as in when you acquire language in childhood or adolescence, certain properties of language are likely to be acquired and others not. There are clearly limits on the process of language development. Children raised without human interaction do not develop language, but the process of language development can proceed in children with a range of limitations and in children raised in environments that vary radically from the typical. So, 2 important things from this paragraph. 1, we are not born to, well, there's no evidence that we are born to acquire language any more than we are born to like Coca-Cola. Okay, Um, we're good at it. Okay, we have very good domain general uh, systems to learn language, but um, but there's no evidence that language is innate. Okay, this is a big debate in the world of linguistics right now, whether or not it's true, that whether or not language is innate or not, or something that just comes from our general intelligence. So this is a big debate. This is not clear. It's not like people suggesting in the comments that it's a clear thing. Well, no, it's not. You know, the 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 two, you know, the two groups in linguistics, you know, Chomsky, anti-Chomsky. It's an important distinction. Um, so let's have a look at some more evidence. Okay, so this is from languages from Papua New Guinea, and now Papua New Guinea is interesting because well, theories of language development are grounded in empirical data from a small number of languages, mostly biased towards the major European languages. Okay, so a lot of people make predictions and theories about how we learn language based, as they say, based on only major European languages. But some of these Papua New Guinea languages are interesting because they have they're different from these Indo-European languages. For example, how much input do these children get in some of these Papua New Guinean languages? So this study indeed shows that child-directed interaction to be infrequent, an average of 3.13 minutes per hour. Okay. Given the assumptions in much of the literature that direct adult input is best for learning, it could be presumed that Yeli Jinne children might show delays in language development. On the contrary, Cassius found that children achieve all their linguistic milestones despite limited child-directed input. Another important type of interaction across Melanesia is peer interaction. Peers are usually considered more challenging conversational partners than adults, but little is known about the impact of peer interaction on the acquisition of language. Okay, so if it was true that input was the way that you acquired language, then these children in these Papua New Guinean languages, they would be delayed, right? Because they are receiving a small amount of input, but they're not. So it tells us that other things are happening. Is it that they spend more time interacting with their peers? Okay, little is known. So any of you out there who think that this is a solved question, you know very little about the debates that are happening in linguistics right now. Okay, let's move on to this one. How can you speak a language, or how can you, produce a language if you don't have the language inside you first? This is an interesting one because on one hand, it's really stupid to suggest that that I could know the word for something without actually learning that word first. Okay, that's just the most basic form of logic. Okay, because language is a shared phenomenon. Okay, this can only be Coca-Cola. It can only be called Coca-Cola if we all agree as a language group that that's what it's called. I can't invent my own word for it. If nobody else knows what this word means, then I can't communicate. So, of course, it's fundamentally obvious that to produce like a noun, for example, I need to first learn that noun. Yeah, we can all agree on that. Okay, that's just again, you'd have to be an idiot to argue against that. But it becomes more complicated when we start to ask the question of, well, let's say I learn these token words like nouns for Coca-Cola or verbs for doing, Does that mean that I have no creativity? Does that mean that I have to input everything before I can produce everything, right? Like, for example, can I produce the present perfect if I've never heard the present perfect? Now, this is where things start to get really interesting. Okay, so again, let's look at some evidence. Okay, so this is by Manuel Bon, Gregor Katchel, and Michael Tomasello. And basically, young children spontaneously created a language. Okay, this is from their summary. So here we show how young children create new communication systems that exhibit the core features of natural languages in less than 30 minutes. This result suggests that children have the basic skills necessary not only to acquire natural language, but also to spontaneously create a new one. So here's an example of children creating a language with zero input. How can that be possible if we can only acquire language in one way? This wouldn't be possible. Also, some more evidence. Okay, so home sign. Home sign is the name given to the spontaneous gesture systems devised by linguistically isolated deaf children for the purpose of communicating with their non-signing peers. This home sign phenomenon has received vanishingly little philosophical attention, despite the fact that it appears to raise a number of deep and significant questions concerning language, thought, and communication. For instance, philosophers appear particularly beholden to a picture of language as a largely static, well-defined structure which is handed over from generation to generation by an arduous process of learning. Language, then, is something that we are given and that we can make use of, but which we play no significant role in creating ourselves. Home sign offers a different perspective. Core properties of language can be built from the ground up in idiosyncratic ways to serve the communicative needs of individuals. Moreover, the relevant cognitive abilities must evidently develop independently of the acquisition of a public language, since home signers possess them, even though they have never been exposed to one. So again, think about this. The input hypothesis tells us that that language is this static external thing that we have to acquire before we can produce and be creative with. And home sign proves that language isn't like that at all. Okay, more evidence. So, beyond input, language learners produce novel relative clause types without exposure by Adam Morgan and Victor Ferreira. Ooh, relative clauses. Let's have a look at this. Here we present 4 experiments which carefully control exposure, such that learners have direct experience with some types of relative clauses, but not with others. In spite of this limited exposure, they are able to produce structures that they have never been exposed to, indicating that they have access to a general representation. It's well known in the linguistics literature that people produce forms that they have never received through input, which wouldn't be possible if we only acquired language in one way. And as the brilliant philosopher Hilary Putnam said, let a complete 17th century Oxford education be innate if you like. Invoking innateness only postpones the problem of learning. It does not solve it. So basically, if we want to suggest that that we can only acquire language by kind of activating it in the brain, it doesn't solve the problem that you still need to learn it, right? Really, really important. Okay, next criticism. You do not understand how comprehensible input works. Well, this is an interesting one again, because my video wasn't about comprehensible input. My video was about the input hypothesis. They're different things completely. Okay. One of them says that when you do receive input, that input should be comprehensible. That's great. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's probably, really important. Okay, probably. That's different from the input hypothesis, which says that we acquire language in only one way. Okay, so I'm not talking about that in the video. So, but let's talk about comprehensible input, because there's this idea, a very dangerous idea, that just because we comprehend something and because we understand it, that means that we acquire it. Okay? So it's like, oh, I'm getting comprehensible input, therefore I'm acquiring it or learning it or whatever you want to call it, right? So this was a study, Michael Bobb, Rebecca Richard, and Ellen Warteller, Just a Talking Book, Word Learning from Watching Baby Videos. Okay, so this study examined the relationship between viewing an infant DVD and expressive and receptive language outcomes. Children between 12 and 15 months were randomly assigned to view Baby Wordsmith, a DVD highlighting words around the house marketed for children beginning at 12 months of age. Viewings took place in home settings over 6 weeks. After every 2 weeks and 5 exposures to the DVD, children were assessed on expressive and receptive communication measures. Results indicated there was no increased growth on either outcome for children who had viewed the DVDs as compared to children in the control group, even after multiple exposures. After controlling for age, gender, cognitive development level, income, parent education, the most significant predictor of vocabulary comprehension and production scores was the amount of time that children were read to. So, although these children were receiving comprehensible input, they didn't learn anything, right? So I think it's dangerous to assume that if you're comprehending something, it means that you know it, okay? It means that not all input is created equal. And here's another very quick one. Metacognitive regulation of text learning on screen versus paper. So, when study time was self-regulated, worse performance was observed on screen than on paper. So basically, if I leave you alone to study a book, you're going to learn less if you're reading the book on a Kindle or on a PDF on a screen than if I gave you a physical book. Okay, so, and this is a metacognitive thing. It means that it's the way that we feel about the input, not actually the content of the input itself. So suggesting that there's only one type of comprehensible input, suggesting that if it's comprehensible, you're automatically going to learn, it's not true. There's no evidence for that because, well, there's evidence against that because we have to think about learner motivation. We have to think about, if the content is compelling, so many factors. Okay. Okay. Next big criticism. Krashen has published a lot of research. Lots. All his researches are free on his website. Read it. Read more, Christian. You're an idiot. Yes, he has published a lot of research, and he continues to do so. And it's very admirable that he makes that research freely available. It's very important in this world. But I think that this criticism suggests that just because something is published, it means that it's true, and it means that everybody agrees that it's true. And that's not how science works, okay? And there's been a lot of criticism against Krashen since he very first published his theories. So let's look at some of this criticism. So this is from Lydia White from McGill University, and this was back in 1987. She said, "As currently formulated, Krashen's input hypothesis is misleading in a number of ways. It implies that by taking the hypothesis into account and providing comprehensible input, Successful L2 acquisition is always possible, and that where it is not possible, this is due to affective barriers alone. However, it runs into a number of difficulties, largely because of its lack of precision. Where comprehensible input is interpreted as simplified input, one is in danger of providing less than adequate input to the acquirer. With its emphasis on meaning and extra-linguistic factors as crucial, the hypothesis neglects the role of system internal changes. It fails to consider cases where the input does not help at all and underestimates the problem of acquisition of form. More criticism. Krashen's Monitor and Occam's Razor by Kevin Gregg from 1987. This is pretty brutal. We have seen that each of Krashen's 5 hypotheses is marked by serious flaws. Undefined or ill-defined terms, unmotivated constructs, lack of empirical content, and thus of falsifiability, lack of explanatory power. His second language acquisition theory is not a coherent theory. It is indeed incoherent to the point that it seems inappropriate to apply the word theory to it. Ooh, brutal. That's not me saying this. This is other researchers. But now, for this final part, okay, we're going to move to, now it's 2021. What is the scientific consensus about the input hypothesis? And what is the evidence about an input-heavy or a mass input approach to learning languages? Is mass input the way to go? Right, let's look at some evidence. And we're going to go chronologically. Okay, so this is from Diane Larson Freeman's book, Teaching Language, from 2003. Okay, and this is what she says. What does the evidence say about the value of teaching grammar in accelerating or complementing the natural process? One influential SLA researcher, Stephen Krashen, would answer this question by saying that explicit grammar instruction has very little impact on the natural acquisition process because studying grammar rules can never lead to their unconscious deployment in fluent communication. Okay, so then it talks about explicit and implicit learning, right? That learning versus acquisition thing, right? Okay, Krashen believes that if input is understood and if there is enough of it, then the necessary grammar will automatically be acquired. Many other researchers dispute this claim. In support of the argument for necessity of attention to linguistic form, Mike Long, who unfortunately died recently, cites the fact that adults often fail to incorporate basic target structures into their interlanguage despite their prolonged exposure to comprehensible input. Another consequence is premature stabilization of their interlanguages. After conducting a meta-analysis of research studies conducted during the last 20 years, Norris and Ortega conclude that focused L2 instruction results in large target-oriented gains, that explicit types of instruction are more effective than implicit types, and that instructional effects are durable. Since it is central to the focus of this book, it is worth highlighting the work of Lightbound and Spada. From among the studies reviewed, they found that teachers who integrate grammar lessons into their communicative teaching are more effective than teachers who never work on grammar or who do so only in decontextualized grammar lessons. Finally, White, 1987, also counters Krashen's claim by proposing that it is actually incomprehensible input that stimulates the necessary grammar building and not comprehensible input. When the learner cannot pass the input, a restructuring of the grammar to account for the input is motivated. Okay, so lots of evidence there from 2003, from lots of different fields of research that you do not acquire language in only one way. And that a mass input approach where, for example, you do not spend time studying grammar or paying attention to linguistic form is not the best way to learn a language. Right, let's move forward to 2012. from this book that we saw earlier, Introducing Second Language Acquisition. The processing of L2 input in interactional situations is facilitative and something also causative of second language acquisition. Benefits come from collaborative expression, modified input, feedback, including correction, and the negotiation of meaning. Second language acquisition is likely to be greatly inhibited if learners are isolated from opportunities for use. Social perspectives generally hold that second language acquisition benefits from the active engagement of learners in the interaction or participation in communicative events. So, getting input without social interaction, so any mass input approach or system that is very focused on, let's say, non-social input, so that would be reading and that would be listening, right? Listening as in like with headphones or, basically when you are receiving input alone, it greatly inhibits your language acquisition. More evidence that the mass input approach is not the best way to learn a language. And this is not from me, okay? You can go and read these books. This is the scientific consensus. More evidence. This is from the Routledge Handbook of Second Language Acquisition from 2012. This focus on input and comprehensibility could also be found in another strand of research that influenced the development of the interactionist approach, Krashen's input hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, input that was comprehensible but slightly above the learner's current level of proficiency was the driving force behind language acquisition. In Krashen's view, if a learner was exposed to this type of input and at the same time had a low affective filter, i.e. low levels of anxiety and negative feelings associated with learning the language, acquisition of the non-native language would automatically, i.e. subconsciously, take place. For Krashen, any mechanism that served to make the input comprehensible, for example, simplifying the grammar, was of value. However, interaction between native speakers and learners did not hold any special place in his theories. However, from the late 1970s, researchers began to accord more importance to interaction itself. Vagnogov and Hatch, for example, maintained that researchers need to examine the relationship between language and communication if we're looking for explanations of the learning process, while Hatch argued that interaction might be an actual site for learning and not just means of observing what had already been learned. In Hatch's words, one learns how to do a conversation, one learns how to interact verbally, and out of the interaction, syntactic structures are developed. Out of the interaction. In the most recent version of the interactionist approach, Gass and Mackey note that it is now, pay attention, it is now commonly accepted within the second language acquisition literature that there is a robust connection between interaction and learning. The interactionist approach posits that interactional work that occurs when a learner and his or her interlocutor, right? Whether a native speaker or more proficient learner, they encounter some kind of communication breakdown is beneficial for L2 development. For example, when a learner experiences difficulty understanding his or her interlocutor or making him or herself understood, discourse strategies such as clarification requests, confirmation checks, repetitions, and recasts may be employed to resolve the difficulty. In this manner, the learner may have received input that has been modified, often in an effort to make it more comprehensible. The process of interaction with another individual may also serve to draw the learner's attention to some sort of gap between his or her interlanguage and the target language. For example, the learner may... Now, the final part of this. This constellation of features, interactionally modified input, having the learner's attention drawn to his or her interlanguage, and to the formal features of the L2, opportunities to produce output, and opportunities to receive feedback are the core components of the interactionist approach and have been investigated in nearly 100 empirical studies since the mid-1990s. Researchers have found that interaction and its features are beneficial for a range of morphosyntactic features, including articles, questions, past tense formations, blah, 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 blah. These results appear to hold true for children as well as adults, and in classrooms as well as laboratory settings, and for a number of languages, including French, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what it says is that interaction, okay, and all of the core components of interaction have been proven by empirical research. This is not me. This is, listen, this is what it says. It says, this is been oh, where is it? The previous slide, yes. It is commonly accepted in the literature. Okay, and finally, now we're going to move to July 2021. This is the final, the fifth edition of this book. It's a very famous book, How Languages Are Learned. And let's look at some of the... So this is the most recent evidence. This was published in July 2021 by two very well-respected language acquisition researchers. Comprehension of meaningful language is the foundation of language acquisition. Really important. The comprehension of meaningful language, right? Active listening and reading for meaning are valuable components of classroom teachers' pedagogical practices. Teachers should be, doing like book floods. They should be giving children time to read alone. They should be reading for fun, right? Reading for pleasure. They should be doing active listening, right? Valuable components. Nevertheless, considerable research and experience challenge the hypothesis that comprehensible input is enough. Input is a big part of language learning, right? It's not the only part, okay? While there is good evidence that learners make considerable progress in both comprehension and production in comprehension-based programs, we do not find support for the hypothesis that language acquisition will take care of itself if L2 learners simply focus on meaning in comprehensible input. Comprehension-based approaches are most successful when they include guided attention to language features. It's not enough just to have comprehensible input. You have to also, pay attention and study, right? Everyone was very upset about my use of, what did I call it? Deliberate practice. Oh, deliberate practice is evil. Oh my God. Researchers overwhelmingly confirmed that vocabulary growth will be limited if the learner does not also engage in focused vocabulary learning activities. Okay, so your vocabulary growth will be limited if you only read books and listen to podcasts, okay? And it's not me. Researchers overwhelmingly confirmed it. Jan Hulstin and Batya Laufer and others provide evidence that vocabulary development is more successful when learners are fully engaged in activities that require them to attend carefully to the new words and even to use them in productive tasks. And just one final piece of evidence, okay? And this is from the Foreign Services Institute, okay? So this is part of the American government that is responsible for training diplomats and spies, and for training government workers that need to go and work overseas. They go to the FSI, the Foreign Service Institute, to learn languages. And back in 2000, I think it was 2000 actually, they published this. Lessons learned from 50 years of theory and practice in government language teaching. Here's what they said. Lesson 3. There is no one right way to teach or learn languages, nor is there a single right syllabus. Students at the FSI and in other government language training programs have learned, and still do learn, languages successfully from syllabi based on audiolingual practice of grammatical patterns, linguistic functions, social situations, task-based learning, community language teaching, the silent way, and combinations of these and other approaches. Spolsky writes, any intelligent and disinterested observer knows that there are many ways to learn languages and many ways to teach them, and that some ways work with some students and in some circumstances and fail with others. This matches our experience precisely. So, let me repeat myself again. Input is really important, okay? I thought that was obvious. But anybody who's suggesting, for example, Stephen Krashen with his input hypothesis, anybody that is suggesting that you can learn a language only through input has an enormous weight of scientific and classroom evidence against them. And also anybody who's suggesting that a mass input approach, which is, I mean, it's difficult to say, right? But focusing a big majority of your time on input, also you are fighting against an enormous weight of scientific and practical classroom evidence. There is no best way to learn a language. There is no one right way to learn a language. There is only the ways that work for you. And while input is important, as I said in my previous video, it is not the whole story. I hope that I've cleared up these questions, and thank you for listening to me, and thank you for I doubt anyone made it to the end, but I got that off my chest. I'll see you in class.